Stop slipping and stop cutting your socks. We have 15 different color options between 3 grip socks and 2 sleeve types. Something for everybody at a price that just makes sense. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
Maybe these ones should have stayed in the bin. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the brand new Puma Future 8 Ultimate, a pair of football boots that has been the center of attention for the better part of a week now, for unfortunately a lot of the wrong reasons and because of a bunch of misinformation, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. Nonetheless, coming from the Future 7, while there are some returning features and elements, for the most part, this is a complete redesign for the Future's 8th generation, some of which I think is very good, some of which I think is pretty questionable, and some of which I think is just downright bad. And you can have it all at a retail price of $240. Where, as you already know, being brutally honest is what this channel is all about, which is why we're going to go over all the details of the Puma Future 8, talk about how they compare to past Future models, as well as all the other amazing football boot options that you can get for around the same price. Spoiler alert, if you've been a fan of the Puma Future series, then you might want to go back in time. So if you want to learn more about them, including how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you appreciate the honesty in these reviews, don't forget to drop a like on the video and make sure you subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots as we head into 2025. Starting with the upper, this is where you're going to see the most significant change coming from not just the Future 7, but all past Future models. Puma have done something here completely different than anything they've done before, where it's effectively made up of 3 main elements: Fusion Fit, Fusion Skin, 3D Fusion Pods, and I guess technically Power Tape, which they really, I guess, should have just called Fusion Tape. Are you confused yet? Okay, I'll stop. Where you can almost look at the design concept as almost a reverse of what Nike introduced in 2018 with the Phantom Vision, which was actually a very good pair of football boots where you had an outer layer of Flyknit for the sake of touch and an inner layer of Quad Fit for the sake of structure without making the boots feel overly stiff. In the case of the Future 8, you have an outer layer that exists for the sake of structure as well as touch on the ball in terms of providing some ridge texturing as well as the Grip Control Pro finish. And then you have an inner layer, which is what they call their Fusion Skin, that is also lined with 3D Fusion Pods, which are there for the sake of added protection as well as to amplify touch on the ball. You can see them underneath the translucent top layer, basically flowing throughout the entire foot. They basically exist as these little rubber pieces that sit on top of an internal Lycra-based elasticated knit internal sock, and then all of your structure is effectively coming from this top layer of what is basically a synthetic upper. There's a little bit of a textile element, as you can see, to it, but the end result is an upper that feels pretty plasticky to the touch. Very pliable, don't get me wrong, but it is quite plasticky, which in itself is a pretty significant change coming from the last several Puma Future models where they've pretty much all had a little bit more of that knitted sock-like feel to the upper. This is completely different though. From a touch and feel perspective, given the extreme design that they've gone for here, I'd argue that these boots feel relatively normal. Can you legitimately feel all of these individual 3D pods scattered across the foot? Not necessarily. Maybe if you're looking out for it the first time that you wear them, yeah, you can tell there are kind of little bumps sitting on top of your foot. But once you start playing and really just get used to the feel of the football boots, it's not something that you notice. This story of amplifying touch is a little bit of a silly one, I would argue, where if anything, if you wanted to feel the ball better, having less material rather than more, in my eyes at least, makes the most sense. Nonetheless, despite the majority of your foot being covered in these little rubber pebbles, the feel for the ball is just fine. I think the most defining characteristic of this upper, however, is just how stiff it is against your foot. While this plasticky material on the surface is quite pliable, it is very stiff and doesn't really stretch much at all, meaning that if your foot isn't exactly this shape, you are going to have some issues in regards to overall comfort, and you are definitely going to have some dead space, because something they've also changed is the depth of the lacing system, where you can see it's very high up, has only 3 anchoring points, and for the most part is just extremely shallow. So from basically just behind your forefoot forward, there is no adjustability to this boot, meaning that all of your lockdown and generally just how the upper is going to wrap your foot is purely down to the shaping of the football boot, where again, if your foot isn't exactly this shape, you are going to have some issues with your foot moving inside of the football boot and generally just not feeling as good as they could have felt. Given that the Future 8 is supposed to be built on the same last as the Future 7 it replaces, because of the changes in material along with this really shallow lacing system, the end result is a football boot that, in my experience, fits significantly worse, and as far as high-end football boots go, is very below average in that particular area, which is not great, because often what you pay a little bit more for with elite tier football boots is a better fit. As far as surface texture is concerned, again, it does have some very subtle ridging that I don't think is necessarily that noticeable on the ball. They also list Grip Control Pro as a feature on this football boot. However, these are nowhere near as grippy as the Puma Ultras, which also feature Grip Control Pro. I would say that they provide enough grip on the ball to not feel slippery, but certainly don't have that ultra grippy sensation of a grip knit material like you'll get from the Nike Phantom series as an example. So for the most part, very similar to, again, what you've had from past Puma Futures in terms of grip on the ball. Sitting underneath the laces is some of that exposed elasticated knit with some pretty significant holes that do allow for breathability, of course, but will also allow dirt and water to get in quite easily, with this area of the foot, similar to the previous generation, being reinforced by power tape. However, this time around, it's simply in the form of this tiny little V of what is basically a TPU plastic type material that's quite thin, but does surprisingly add a bunch of structure and effectively prevent this area of the upper from stretching too much. Where the idea behind it is that this little bit of added structure is supposed to drive your heel down and back into the football boot. As a concept, it makes sense. In reality, is it really doing that? Probably not. You can feel a little bit of extra tightness and tension in this area of the foot, specifically where the power tape is located, but in terms of providing any additional lockdown, I really don't think it's doing much at all, which is particularly noticeable if you try to play in these boots without the laces tied or with the laces removed entirely, something that has become a bit of a trend with the Puma Future series. This, I would say, is probably the worst Puma Future ever created in terms of being able to wear them laceless. Moving to the rear, Puma haven't really done anything drastically different coming from the Future 7. I would still personally consider this to be a low-cut design, where of course it does extend a little bit higher at the sides, back, and front by way of this elasticated knit material, but that ultimately does pretty much nothing from a structure or lockdown perspective. It's just there for the sake of looks. You have an internal plastic heel counter, which is nice and solid. Love to see that. And then the heel liner has been changed up slightly. From what I can tell, there's actually a little bit less padding than the previous generation, but from a shaping perspective, it feels pretty much the same to me. And then the insole, fully removable. I'll give you guys a quick look at that. It, for the most part, also hasn't changed, where they do list in the tech specs that it has a nano grip lining material. This one does not. However, this is technically a pre-release colorway, so it's worth noting that the graphics could change quite significantly from what you see here when we actually get the general releases. The same thing can go for the material of the insole. So it's possible that we'll get that grippier material that we have seen on Pumas in the past, but this particular pair does not have that. This is pretty much just a standard mesh. And then the insole itself, from a construction standpoint, is exactly the same. A white foam with some yellow perforated foam inserts. Pretty run-of-the-mill for a pair of high-end football boots. And then there's the base of the boot, where you'll find a completely redesigned sole plate and stud pattern, something that has been the main point of contention and misinformation around the Puma Future 8. I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail because I actually posted a YouTube Shorts video explaining it, but long story short, Marc Cucurella was wearing the new Future 8 in a match. He slips twice. Both of those slips resulted in a goal against, and out of pure desperation and just trying to change things up, he went to the sideline, switched back into his old Puma Future 7s, never slipped again, and ultimately Chelsea won the match, where of course he controversially and I think jokingly in his mind posted a picture of his new Future 8s in the bin. With the key thing to recognize about this situation that the media, as well as plenty of people on social media, have failed to recognize is that he was wearing a soft ground version of this football boot, meaning that the sole plate and stud pattern was exactly the same as his old Puma Futures. Where, as a bunch of you pointed out, it's entirely possible that the Future 7s he switched into had slightly longer screw-in metal studs, which is an option when it comes to soft ground boots. However, we'll probably never know if that's the case, and the key takeaway here is that every player on the pitch during that match was wearing some variation of a soft ground stud pattern where they're pretty much industry standard across the board. Sometimes, however, you just slip. As for the redesigned FG sole plate and stud pattern, if you look at it side by side with the Future 7 that it replaces, you can very clearly see that as far as redesigns go, this is about as subtle a change that you can make, where the stud placement and shape has only been slightly modified, with realistically these two studs being a slightly different shape. This one's pushed a little bit further back, but other than that, pretty much everything else is the same. Meaning that from a traction standpoint, you're probably not going to notice much of a difference at all. At least that wasn't the case for me. It's still an aggressive stud pattern and ultimately does feel quite good. However, what is important to note though is that Puma does not list this as FG-AG as they have done with so many boots in the past. This is strictly FG, meaning that they are saying that you probably shouldn't be wearing this on artificial grass, and I tend to agree with them on that. This is pretty much all bladed studs all the way through at different angles, so while it performs fine on natural grass and you still have that freedom to twist and pivot a little bit, on artificial grass, not only are the studs quite long, longer than you would want for that type of a playing surface, they're also very aggressive in their shaping. So when you do plant your foot, you're pretty much going to be stuck in place, which is going to severely increase your potential risk of injury. And that's advice that doesn't just apply to these football boots. I'd apply that to any FG boot with a bladed stud pattern. They're just not made for artificial grass, but on natural grass, I do think this performs quite well. However, it's not a huge upgrade over what we had before. What is at least a little bit different though is the stud pattern, where I think historically the Puma Future has had what I would argue is a more flexible layout. This one, however, is just more structured and a little bit firmer. The midfoot pretty much has no give to it whatsoever, giving it a nice solid underfoot feel, if that's something that you like, where the forefoot just has some really good stiffness to it, again, if that's your preference. With this change not necessarily being better or worse than what they were doing before, however, I would make the argument that because of how stiff this upper feels on your foot, given that it really has no stretch to it, when you pair that up with a stiffer sole plate, the end result is a pair of football boots that I think feel above average stiff for what you're going to find from pretty much any top-end model. And then there's the weight, where I guess to put it nicely, something that really surprised me about the Future 8 as soon as I pulled it out of the box is they definitely have some noticeable substance to them. Whereas we always do, let's weigh the new one against the old one and see if there's any difference. Starting off with the Future 7 Ultimate, which of course is now the outgoing model. They weigh in at 7.9 ounces, the equivalent of 223 grams. Change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the new Future 8 Ultimate, and you can see that they weigh in at 9.55 ounces, the equivalent of 272 grams, which is quite easily the biggest weight increase we've seen in a new pair of football boots in quite some time, and quite comfortably puts the Future 8 Ultimate as the heaviest pair of top-end football boots on offer from the big three brands. Where, don't get me wrong, they're not unwearably heavy, but they certainly don't have that ultra lightweight feel and technically do qualify as the heaviest Puma Futures to date. On feet, the Future 8 is about as unexceptional as you're going to find from a pair of top-end football boots. I think the major letdown here is the shaping and the adjustability, or I suppose the lack thereof, where what I really find with this boot is that it's relatively shallow through the heel and midfoot, and then the forefoot, because it doesn't have any lacing system whatsoever, paired up with what is a really structured but still pliable kind of plasticky synthetic upper, is your foot pretty much just fills in the space that it can, and then all the dead space that inevitably gets left around that area, you kind of just have to live with. The lockdown through the midfoot, I would say, is fine, but it's where all the pressure is because of how short the lacing system is. So if you're somebody with slightly flatter feet like myself, you're definitely going to find a significant pinch in this area of the foot, which is a recipe for foot cramping, something that I did experience during the break-in process of the Future 8, where the heel lockdown, again, just because the lacing system doesn't seem to come up far enough or go down low enough, just doesn't feel all that good. Not to the point where I'm slipping so much where it's going to cause blisters, but it's certainly not as good as what we've had from Puma Futures in the past, and certainly not what you expect from a $240 pair of football boots. Where, like I talked about earlier, the sole plate is stiffer than what was found on past Puma Future models, but that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's more so down to personal preference, where personally, I don't mind the way that it feels. Again, the disappointing part for me here is that they're not particularly comfortable, they don't fit particularly well, and the lockdown is subpar to say the least. All characteristics that have typically been very strong aspects of the Puma Future. Unfortunately, not the case with the latest model. From a width perspective, I don't necessarily think this would be a great option for somebody with wide feet, especially if you need some extra width in the midfoot or around the toe box area, because it does have quite the pointed shape. Again, just a lack of adjustability makes this a football boot that isn't really going to fit most people ideally if you're looking to have that no dead space fit from your high-end boots, which you can totally get from other options outside of the Future 8. And then as far as sizing is concerned, I'm wearing these boots in my usual size 9.5 US. And just like the previous generation, they run about a quarter size long, where I'm still wearing them in my normal size. It's not long enough to where I can personally go down half a size, but if you're currently wearing your football boots with a little bit of extra space, if you are interested in the Future 8 or even the Future 7 for that matter, going half a size down wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. For those that are already wearing their boots quite snug though, true to size is what I would recommend. So in conclusion, while I can really appreciate Puma genuinely trying to do something different with the Future 8 Ultimate, this is unfortunately one of those situations where it just didn't work out. Where the boots certainly aren't unwearable, but from a fit, feel, and certainly comfort perspective, I do feel that there may be a step or two behind pretty much every other high-end boot on the market. And given that Puma is currently chasing market share with the Puma Future, I'm not sure that there's very many people that are going to try these on and say to themselves, wow, these feel really good. Let me pick them over literally every other option. It's the perfect example of what is a really cool idea with questionable execution.